Welcome to the Reach Young Adult Ministry Podcast with your teacher, Pastor Taylor Gabbert.
There is a stirring, there is a hunger.
In the Christian life, we are told to view things with eyes of faith. We're constantly told to look at the unseen, to see the unseen, to be paying attention for spiritual things instead of physical things. I read a book recently. Friedrich Nietzsche, the guy who is famous for saying God is dead, he wrote a book called Antichrist. And that book is his takedown of Christianity. It is him walking through all the reasons that Christianity is false. I decided to see what all the hype was about, and I went and I read it. And as I read it, this was the best analogy I could think of. It appeared to be like if somebody who was colorblind was angry at you for believing in colors. He was on a rant about things that it was impossible to even explain to him how far off of the truth he was. He was blind to spiritual realities. He couldn't see what actually was going on. The thing about spiritual truths, the thing about watching God move and seeing God move is that the more you do it, the more often you'll see it. The more you train yourself to look for what God's doing, you'll start to see it constantly. Have you ever seen a car that you really like, and then all of a sudden you see that car everywhere? It's the same principle. When you begin to train your mind to look for God's movement, to look for spiritual things, all of a sudden you will see spiritual things. But if you've never seen anything spiritual, if you don't even know what that looks like, you won't see it anywhere. And then when people talk about it, it not only doesn't make sense, it seems absurd. My question for you tonight is, are your eyes open? Are you seeing with open eyes the spiritual side of life? The reality of who God is and what He's doing on a daily basis. We're in a series on Elisha. We're in 2 Kings chapter 6 tonight. And the first thing we're going to see is we're going to see God act in the small. If you look in chapter 6, verse 1. Now the sons of the prophets said to Elisha, "Behold now, the place before you where we are living is too cramped for us. Please let us go to the Jordan, and let us each take from there a beam, and let us construct a place there for ourselves to live there." So he said, "Go." Then one of them said, "Please agree to go with your servants." And he said, "I will go." So he went with them, and when they came to the Jordan, they cut down trees. But it happened that as one of them was cutting down a beam, the axe head fell into the water, and he cried out and said, "Oh, my master, it was borrowed." Then the man of God said, "Where did it fall?" And when he showed him the place, he cut off the stick and threw it in there, and he made the iron float. Then he said, "Pick it up for yourself." So he reached out his hand and took it. So the sons of the prophets, these are essentially preachers in the land. They would have been probably being trained by Elisha. He would have been one of their main mentor. And they have an issue. Their home is getting overcrowded. It's too close quarters. They have a need. Now, it's not a necessity need. You know, if they have food and they have shelter and they have clothes, you know, they have what they need. But at the same time, they see a functional need for their lives, something that they think they need to have. And what do they do first? They ask God before they move. The very first thing they do is they seek Elisha's counsel. Now remember, Elisha is the human representative of this time to the people of God from God. He represents God. So them seeking Him in this way is to ask God, what's your will? what do you have for us? We want to go do this thing. We see a need. But even though they see a practical need, they don't just jump out there. They don't just set out and do it. They ask God first. Just because you see a need in your life, it doesn't exempt you from the process of participating in what God is doing. They don't lean on their own understanding. And not only that, but then after they get permission to go, they don't do this number that we do so often. This is clearly God's will, so I'll handle it. No, they then, after they get permission, they say, come with us. Go with us. Be a part of this process. Listen, the understanding here is God had better go with us, or even if it's God's will, it won't be the success. We won't have God's provision when the next crisis hits, when the next thing happens. Moses does this. Moses is in the desert, and God says, take the people, go that way. And he says, only if you come with me. Moses understood that he needed to be where God was every step of the way. Here's the reality. If you get what you think you want or what you think you need and God's not there, you've got nothing. It's not going to be fulfilling. It's not going to give you whatever necessity, whatever need you thought it was going to fulfill. There's no joy in it. There might be a lasting kind of happiness for a moment. But the reality is what they recognized here was we need God to go with us. Go with God. Now, the other thing that we need to recognize here is how often do we give God credit for our bad plans? We say, well, this is what God told me to go do. And God's up in heaven going, I had nothing to do with that. That's all on you. You decided you were going to do that. You decided that was your need. You decided how you were going to go do that. But we give God credit for it. And then when it crashes, we do one of two things. We either blame God. Now we're mad at God because we didn't listen to him in the first place. We went out on our own and something went wrong. Or we now have to explain it away. Well, yeah, that is what God wanted me to do, but there's other factors and there's other reasons. Because we don't just want to admit, you know what, that was me. That was all me. That was my plan. I was running the show. What happens when you go out on your own and the next crisis hits? You immediately have to doubt exactly where you are and exactly how you're going about it. That's what we're going to see in this first section. They go out with God. They go out according to God's will. They go out with God. And then when the next crisis hits, while they're in the middle of doing this, they don't have to go, we should have never come here. We should have never done this. It doesn't make any sense. I don't know why we're here anymore. Because they knew that they not only had God's permission, but they had God with them. Now they can resort to him. Instead of blaming him, instead of explaining it away, he's right there. This is why you need to go to God before you move. Because then, when God gives you permission to go, he's going to be with you every step of the way as the next thing comes up. The next thing we see is that they depend on God in the crisis. Listen, this axe head, right now in your heads, you're going, well, you can go get an axe at Walmart. It's not that expensive. Listen, in this time period, this axe head, this iron tool, this cost more than this guy can make. That's why he's loaning it in the first place. He's not able to afford this. He's borrowed it and now he's lost it and he's going to go into debt. And debt, a lot of times in ancient times, was followed with slavery. When you couldn't pay a debt, that your whole life is about to change. Right? But what does he do in the moment that he gets in this crisis? He turns to God. Listen, we panic for way less than this guy's about to go into slavery over. He doesn't panic. Now, that doesn't mean he's not distressed, but in his distress, he turns to God. Look at Peter. When Peter is walking on water in the New Testament, he sinks into the water, and what does he do next? He swims harder. No. He cries out for Jesus to save him. Immediately. That's his first reaction. And what does the Bible say that Jesus does? Jesus saves him. When? Immediately. Do you see where I'm getting at? Stop handling stuff by yourself. Do you know that they actually teach lifeguards on beaches not to rescue people that are flailing, that are still trying to actively save themselves? Because it's a danger for the lifeguard. God's not going to let you hurt a bunch of other people around you while you're trying to handle things your own way. You have to turn to Him in your distress and stop trying to save yourself. The next thing we see is that God cares about your life. Okay, I want you to hear me on this. If you've ever heard the John 3:16, replace the world with your name, God doesn't just care about the whole world. He cares about you as an individual. He cares about your problems. He cares about you on a daily basis, even in the small stuff. In the middle of your day-to-day crisis, God still cares. Look at the life of Jesus. I think we discount that Jesus was demonstrating actively God's character in a way we could see it. So if Jesus represents God and is God and was God on earth, and Jesus was constantly stopping and caring and loving for people, why would that not be God's character when you pray to Him? It's like you disconnect the gospel of Jesus Christ from the reality of who God is. God cares. He stops. He loves. And then the last thing we see in this section is that Elisha tells him to reach in and grab the axe head himself. Why? God loving you and caring for you does not mean that you just get to sit on the couch and He caters to your every whim. This guy actively participates in what God's doing in his life. He sees a miracle. He turns to God in his distress. He sees a miracle. And then God says, okay, pick it up. He participates at the end. So we see that God acts in the small. Now see that God acts in the big. Look at verse 8. Now the king of Aram was making war against Israel. And he consulted with his servants, saying, in such and such a place shall be my camp. But the man of God sent word to the king of Israel, saying, be careful that you do not pass this place, because the Arameans are coming down there. And the king of Israel sent scouts to the place about which the man of God had told him. So he warned him, so that he was on his guard there more than once or twice. Now the heart of the king of Aram was enraged over this matter, and he called his servants and said to them, will you not tell me which of us is for the king of Israel? One of his servants said, no, my lord the king. But Elisha, the prophet who is in Israel, tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedroom. So he said, go and see where he is, so that I may send men and take him. And it was told to him, saying, behold, he is in Dothan. So he sent horses and chariots and a substantial army there, and they came by night and surrounded the city. Listen. What's happening here? Elisha, the representative of God, he is seeing the enemy's battle plans, the enemy's raiding plans against the nation of Israel. He's doing it so effectively that the enemy army thinks they have a spy. And his own servants testify to him saying, listen, this guy Elisha, he knows what's going on in your bedroom. They are terrified, and they're giving testimony to the one true God that's in Israel, because the one true God that's in Israel sees everything. God sees everything. I have a question. Do you actually believe that God is all-knowing? Past, present, and future. That He sees everything, knows everything. Or are you panicking because you think He's just reacting? God's overwhelmed. He can't handle my situation. He's trying to keep up as best He can. I'm probably the person that's fallen through the cracks. No. God sees everything. He knows everything. You don't have to panic because something that's new to you in the moment, it's not new to God. It didn't catch him off guard just because it caught you off guard. That is the great news about who God is that he does see it. If God can't see further out than I can, then we're in trouble. Because I can't see further out than the next second. Open your eyes. Look in verse 15. Now when the attendant of the man of God had risen early and gone out, behold, an army with horses and chariots was circling the city, and his servant said to him, "This is hopeless, my master. What are we to do?" And he said, "Do not be afraid, for those who are with us are greater than those who are with them." Then Elisha prayed and said, "Lord, please open his eyes so that he may see." And the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. And when they came down to him, Elisha prayed to the Lord and said, "Please strike this people with blindness." So he struck them with blindness in accordance with the word of Elisha. Then Elisha said to them, "This is not the way, nor is this the city. Follow me, and I will bring you to the man whom you seek." And he brought them into Samaria. When they had come into Samaria, Elisha said, "Lord, open the eyes of these men, so that they may see." And the Lord opened their eyes, and they saw, and behold, they were in the midst of Samaria. Listen, the first thing that his servant says to him is, it's hopeless. It's hopeless. We're surrounded. Listen, we are not ever hopeless. The world is hopeless. If you're a child of the living God, you are never without hope. That is not the case for us. And Elisha says to him, "Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid." He immediately answers him with the confidence of who God is. And then what does Elisha do in this story? Before anything else, he prays, and he prays again. 3 times he goes to God with prayer before acting. He's constantly asking God to participate in his will. Now, does he still act? Yes, he still acts. He prays and then he acts. So the question for you is, do you pray or do you act? The answer is yes. You do both. That's what Elisha is demonstrating here. He's not sitting on the couch doing nothing. He's participating, but he's praying in the entire process. Listen, prayer is how we participate in what God is doing. It's not just how we participate, it's how we know how to participate. How else are you going to know what God wants for you to do if you're not praying? If you're not involved in the conversation? There has to be communication for you to get your marching orders. So we pray because it's how we participate. It's how we know how we participate. It's also how we see what God is doing. It's like orienting yourself to look the right direction. Now, think about this. The Bible tells us that if we have the faith of a mustard seed, we can move a mountain. We could tell a mountain, get up and move. Anyone in here ever moved a mountain? The reality is, if you will orient yourself to what God is doing, He's already moving mountains. You're just not looking where they're being moved. And on top of that, if you will begin to orient yourself to God's will and match your heart with His heart as you pray, then when you want that mountain to move, it will be at the same time that God wants that mountain to move. And then when you say, "Lord, I want that mountain to move," it's going to move. That's the whole point of prayer. It's a process by which we mold our hearts to God's heart, and we want what He wants when He wants it, and then we're looking in the right direction when God moves the mountain, and we're so in tune with Him that we get to be a part of it. That's the whole point. Elisha right now is demonstrating this active participation where he is praying and molding his heart to who God is, and he wants what God wants when He wants it, and everything Elisha prays for, it happens. It's not because God is obeying orders from Elisha. It's because they're so close, they want the same thing. I asked you if you actually believe that God is all-knowing. The next question is, do you actually believe that God is all-powerful? Like, do you actually believe that in a way that it would affect the way that you live? Here's the thing. What is the significance of your belief? Because if you believe that God is all-knowing and you believe that God is all-powerful, it should have an effect over the choices that you're making on a daily basis. It should change things about the way you're living. What is having a fear of the Lord? Fearing the Lord is understanding so clearly who's in charge that you're afraid to be on the wrong side. It's a respect for the power and the authority of the king. It's a respect for the fact that he knows and he is able. Listen, chariots in the ancient world, chariots were the nuclear arsenal. The more chariots you had, the more powerful you were. What Elisha and his servant see in this moment is God's got the most chariots and they're on fire. This is just insane, right? This is so much power. It's the enemy army doesn't even realize how much danger they're in. That's why it's like Elisha is like still eating cereal that morning, kind of like getting the stuff out of his eyes going, what are you worried about? Can you not see the chariots? Can you not see God's power? And what did he do? He has trained himself to see God. He's seen God in all the small cases, and he's seen God in all the big cases. But what do we see for the world? The enemy army is blind. They can't see the chariots, and after more prayer, they're even concealed from seeing the situation, what's going on, what the truth is. And Elisha, he then marches this enemy army into enemy territory where they are surrounded and they're outnumbered. They're the ones that are embarrassed and humbled. And then what? After you begin to see God handling things and moving in the big and the small, you need to begin to handle things in God's way. Look at verse 21. Then the king of Israel, when he saw them, said to Elisha, My father, shall I kill them? Shall I kill them? But he answered, You shall not kill them. Would you kill those whom you have taken captive with your sword and your bow? Set bread and water before them, so that they may eat and drink and go to their master. So he provided a large feast for them. And when they had eaten and drunk, he sent them away, and they went to their master. And the marauding bands of the Arameans did not come again into the land of Israel. Okay. The king immediately focuses on what he can see. This is a golden opportunity. I'm going to handle this. Keep in mind, this is only a fraction of the enemy army. But he's saying, I can see an opportunity. I can kill a massive portion of our enemies here. What do you think the enemy king would have done? At this point, it's kind of like a raiding war. They're just kind of having these minor skirmishes. What do you think the enemy king is going to do when you wipe out a portion of his army? Now it's time to invade. Now we're in all-out war. Now we've made it worse because we handled it based on our own understanding. Listen, every single time in my life that I handle it, it gets worse. I have never made anything better by doing it my way. Not one time. I'm constantly making it a poorer situation. You know why? It's because I can't see everything. I can't see all the factors. I can't see, and I'm not all powerful. I can't make anything happen the way I want it to. I'm taking my limited knowledge and my limited power, and I'm throwing it up against a situation I can't even begin to understand, instead of depending on a God who can see it all and who can handle it all. Does God's answer in this situation make sense? No. Feed your enemies, send them back to their enemy commander so that they can be used against you again? It doesn't make sense. This is, by the way, this is not a good military strategy. Does God's answer make sense in our lives? No. Good. That's the point. That's what walking in faith is. That's what looking for unseen things, looking for spiritual things. It's when you begin to realize that God's solutions, they don't make sense to me because He's bigger and He's smarter Peter in the New Testament constantly had dumb suggestions. We see him as the apostle was always putting his foot in his mouth. He was always focused on what he could see, what he could understand, what made sense to him in the moment. And Jesus very often had patience with him. There's at least one moment where Peter says, well, Jesus, there's a way we're going to do this. And Jesus looks him in the face and says, get behind me, Satan. You are focused on the wrong thing. And because of that, you're a tool of the enemy right now. God's solutions only give him glory. They're the unseen solutions. All of God's solutions will constantly cause you to think this: how on earth did that work out? That's how you know God did it. Because you can't pat yourself on the back, it won't even make sense. But yet somehow it ends up working out the best way it possibly could. And then what do we see in this situation? The enemy army, they stay out. They stop raiding. God took care of it in a way that instead of making it worse, instead of making it all-out war, they got rest. They got peace. After you begin to see God in the small things, and you see God in the big things, begin to anticipate seeing more. Look at verse 24. Now it came about after this that Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram, gathered all his army and went up and besieged Samaria. And there was a severe famine in Samaria, and behold, they kept besieging it until a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels of silver, and a fourth of a cab of dove's dung for 5 shekels of silver. And as the king of Israel was passing by the wall, a woman cried out to him, saying, Help, my lord the king. But he said, If the Lord does not help you, from where am I to help you? From the threshing floor or from the winepress? Then the king said to her, What is on your mind? And she said, This woman said to me, Give your son so that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow. So we cooked my son and ate him, and I said to her on the next day, Give your son so that we may eat him. But she has hidden her son. When the king heard the woman's words, he tore his clothes, and he was passing by on the wall, and the people looked, and behold, he had sackcloth underneath on his body. Then he said, May God do so to me, and more so, if the head of Elisha the son of Shaphat remains on him today. Listen, I want to give a clarification with this first piece of this. God is not asking you to fake it. We do not have a fake it till you make it religion. This is not paste a smile on. Don't let anybody see what's wrong. Listen, sometimes you're in crisis. Face that crisis. See it. Mourn in it. Feel it. Sometimes this world is horrifying. Listen, a donkey's head, a donkey was an unclean animal. They're selling a donkey's head. They weren't even supposed to eat donkeys. They're selling the head for food. And that dove's dung comment, I found 3 possible explanations for this. It's either beans, wild onions, or bird poop. That's a loss no matter which option it is. There's no good version there. And it's selling for a super high price because the people are starving. Sometimes life is horrifying. But don't forget who God is. Don't forget that He's all-powerful. Don't forget that He's all-knowing. Listen, this life is a shadow of what's to come. It's a temporary, momentary vapor. I quote this verse all the time, but I can't get past it. It's one of my favorite verses in the Bible. 2 Corinthians 4:17. For our momentary light affliction. Keep in mind what they're going through. For our momentary light affliction is producing for us an absolutely incomparable eternal weight of glory. That's the comparison. We're talking about now, this minuscule, temporary, vapor moment in time that can be horrible compared to all of eternity, where we'll be with Jesus, where we'll be with God, where everything will be right. don't focus on the wrong one. Because you can get really mad at God looking at right here, right now. And you can miss the small things He's doing. You can miss the big things He's doing. And you can miss out on eternity. Don't blame God. The king immediately forgets everything that's happened, any deliverance that God has given. As soon as he's in this new crisis, he loses his perspective. And now, all of a sudden, he's blaming God for the problem that's at hand. The last point we're going to see is that I want you guys to see salvation and don't miss out. Look at verse 32. Now Elisha was sitting in his house, and the elders were sitting with him. And the king sent a man from his presence. But before the messenger came to him, he said to the elders, "Do you see how the son of a murderer has sent a man to cut off my head? Look, when the messenger comes, shut the door and hold the door shut against him. Is the sound of his master's feet not behind him?" I'm going to read the next verse. While he was still talking with them, behold, the messenger came down to him, and he said, "Behold, this evil is from the Lord. Why should I wait for the Lord any longer?" All right, so the king, right, is busy blaming God. And he sends an assassin. He's now in opposition. He's rejecting God's authority. He is attacking the man of God. It's a little bit confusing for the way it's worded, but I think what I see in my study is that the last line of this verse 33, "Behold, this evil is from the Lord. Why should I wait for the Lord any longer?" I think that's the king speaking. It seems to be that he follows the assassin down, and he is giving his appeal for why God's at fault here. Why he's going the route he's going, because God's clearly not providing. God's the one who's caused this evil. Why should I wait on God any longer? So we see that the king is blaming God. He's opposing God. He's rejecting God. And what's the other group of people that we see in this part of the story? The elders. What are they doing? They're seeking God. They're with Elisha in his house, getting counsel by him. Be with God. Seek Him. Listen, if you're not having your quiet time, you're quite frankly, you're missing out on all that life has to offer. You're missing out on what God has for you, and you're not going to be ready when the crisis comes. You're not going to be ready when the trial gets worse. Are you having your quiet time? Are you receiving God's word into your heart? Are you praying and offering up your heart to match His? Are you in church? And not just, by the way, sitting on the outer rim of church, not just in the room while church is happening. Are you a part of the church? Are you serving? Are you plugged in? Do you have community? Do you have discipleship? Are you pouring into somebody? Do you know that you grow, I would honestly say, more pouring into somebody than you do getting poured into? We're always in receive mode, but the reality is we know this in real life. We say, if you want to learn something, teach it. That applies to Christianity. If you want to figure out how to walk like Jesus, try showing somebody else. And if you think, I don't know, I don't feel ready for that, or I don't feel equipped, good, you're not. That's not the point. The point is, find somebody who's a half step behind you and say, "Hey, I'm just trying to go towards Jesus. You want to come?" And find somebody who's a half step in front of you and grab hold of them and say, "Hey, I see you're going towards Jesus. I want to come." That's all discipleship is. And you will grow so much in those relationships. And then my last thing is, are you worshiping God? Like, are you focusing on worshiping God? Is the reason you have your quiet time in the morning because it's a block you got to check to know that you've met your holiness criteria? Or are you worshiping God by spending time with Him? Are you sacrificing to God your time and your energy and your effort and your money and your influence? Or is it just all about you? Be with God. Be in His presence. Know Him, so that when you're in this season, everyone in here has been in a besieged season of life where you're surrounded and things are getting worse. Some of you are in it right now. And there's no comfort in that. There's no way out of that doesn't involve all of these things. Time with God, knowing who He is. Oftentimes, God lets the siege continue because He's waiting for you to seek Him in it. I want you to see in chapter 7, verse 1. I want you to see that you just have to wait one more day. Then Elisha said, "Listen to the word of the Lord. This is what the Lord says. About this time tomorrow, a measure of fine flour will be sold for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria." Okay. Here's the thing. The king in this moment, he's blaming God. He says, "How long should I have to wait? This is clearly from God. Why am I still waiting on God?" Listen, you know that whatever day God decides to provide on, at some point, there was only one day before that. That sounds stupid, but just stick with me. Like, the reality is, at any given moment, you could be one day away from God's provision. It could be literally right on the other side. And let me ask you this. What's your other option? Turn around and go back? Quit? There's not a better option. There's not like an alternative. If you're saying, well, God hasn't provided yet, okay, and you've got some other way to handle this that's not going to make it worse. We had this phrase when I was in training, when things would get really bad, we would always tell each other, "I'm going to quit tomorrow." And then the next day you'd wake up and somebody would go, "So you're going to quit today?" No, I'm going to quit tomorrow. Because tomorrow never came. The reality is, you're not responsible for tomorrow or next week or next month. You are responsible for today. Actually, that's not even true. You're not even responsible for today. You're responsible for this moment right in front of your face. And do you know what the moment right in front of your face, you know what your actual responsibility in that moment is? To worship God. That's it. That's it. When we say abide, it's the obedience and the worshiping of God right here, right now, one moment at a time. We're not talking about next week, next month, 10 years from now. Am I worshiping God in this moment? I'm going to let Him handle everything after right now. And do you know what I'm doing with this moment? Worship is me giving it back to Him. Oh, Lord, thank you for this moment. Take it back. This is for you. That's your whole life. One moment at a time is offering it up to God. And then when you begin to do that, you get to watch God's character show. See God provide. Look in verse 2. The royal officer on whose hand the king was leaning responded to the man of God and said, "Even if the Lord were to make windows in heaven, could this thing happen?" Then he said, "Behold, you are going to see it with your own eyes, but you will not eat any of it." You know what happens next in this story? In the rest of this story, the very next day, they get provided for. The enemy army retreats and leaves behind all their food and all their supplies, and the people feast. Look at verse 17. Now the king appointed the royal officer on whose hand he leaned to be in charge of the gate, but the people trampled on him at the gate, and he died, just as the man of God had said, who spoke when the king came down to him. This guy, he says, by tomorrow, things are going to be better. Again, what did I say? You're only, at a minimum, you're one day away from God's provision. And this guy couldn't believe that God was powerful enough to get it done by tomorrow. He couldn't see it. He didn't know how to look for unseen things. He didn't believe it. And guess what happened? He missed out. Don't miss out. Several of you have heard me talk about names of God, but this one just blows my mind. Jehovah Jireh is the name of God that means the Lord provides. And I haven't studied every name of God, but it's the only one I've found so far that has a condition. It's the Lord who provides on His mountain. What does that mean? First of all, names of God, they're true at all times. God's nature is never failing. So if God's the Lord who provides, He's always providing. But there's a condition. Where's He providing? In His will. When you're walking in His will, when you're with Him, when you're on His mountain, He's providing. Here's the great thing about God. God won't even let that condition hold Him. Do you know what God's providing when you're not on His mountain? Discipline to turn you back to His mountain. And trust me, that's provision, because if you're not on the Lord's mountain, you want to be. There's no better place to be. That is where God provides, on His mountain, for His glory, to His people. This guard, he didn't see God in the small things. He didn't see God in the big things. He didn't anticipate God. He didn't see salvation, and he missed out. You know, the Bible tells us that there are people that will miss out on eternity. There are people that will never see what God has until it's too late. You have a limited number of time, a limited amount of time on this earth to figure this out and make this decision. I tell you guys that if you are a non-believer, this decision, figuring this out, it's the difference between life and death. It's the difference between heaven and hell. It's the difference between missing out on all that God has in eternity. If you are a believer, this battle is for you missing out on what God has for you right now. It's about being useful or useless. I desperately want to get what God has for me right now. I don't just want to coast until I just make it to heaven. I want to be involved in all that God has for me here and all that God has for me there. Learn to see God in the small things. Learn to see God and turn to Him in the small day-to-day situations. When you learn to see that, you'll learn to trust and see Him in the big situations, in the overwhelming stuff. When you begin to see Him in the big situations and trust Him in the overwhelming stuff, you'll begin to anticipate seeing God in everything you do. And you won't miss out. You won't miss out on what God has for you now, and you won't miss out on what God has for you in salvation.
Hey guys, this is Philip Jackson, pastor to young adults at Evergreen Baptist Church. I want to invite you to come to Reach. We meet every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. at Evergreen Church in South Tulsa, just east of Mingo on 111th Street. The mission of Reach Tulsa is to cultivate a young adult community that's defined by real transformation and a sincere pursuit of a godly life through training in biblical disciplines, personal development, and intentionally transitioning into independence as mature members of the body of Christ. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like and subscribe to our content. We're available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Reach Young Adult Ministry is a part of Evergreen Baptist Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. For more information and additional lessons, please visit our website, evergreenbc.org.